Well, good morning, Legacy Bible Church. It's Wednesday morning, and we're here with Sarah for another Q&A, and we're so glad that you've joined us. So, Sarah, we can just get right into it. You have something that we're going to talk about today. Why don't you tell us what that is?
Okay, so we had already talked about women's role in the church, and it was very brief. Even though we were supposed to have these brief, they end up being long because there's always so much to talk about. But I don't feel like it was we fully covered everything that I think I have questions on. So one thing you challenged me with was going and seeing what actual other churches or preachers think about women's role. And I happened to listen to a podcast on Friday about a woman's role in the church. And I just thought it was interesting because they would talk about 1 Corinthians 11, 3 through 10. And for those who don't know, that's where Paul talks about a woman's head being covered. So they talked about that, but they said the head being covered is just under man's authority. So a woman is allowed to teach and speak and have like leadership roles in the church as long as she is submitted to a man's authority. The podcast, the person I was speaking to did say absolutely under no circumstances is a woman to be ordained as a pastor in a church. So I started thinking about that, thinking a little about what we talked about, and then I just found it interesting and wanted to hear your thoughts how most churches will address the women being covered and they'll always just put it under authority. That's not the first time I've heard that. But what about, when you start digging deeper, what about 1 Corinthians 14? And I was going to, if people don't know that one in particular, 1 Corinthians 14:33, where it talks, where Paul is very, even more, like, I guess, harsh. Women should keep silent in the churches. They're not permitted to speak. If they desire to learn anything, they need to ask their husbands. So you have that. And then if you go to 1 Timothy, that's even more harsh. So 1 Timothy, women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel. It goes on about their modesty. They shouldn't wear hair braided gold pearls. But then it even goes on to say, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Okay, so if I'm listening to this other podcast where it says a woman that they can teach, have leadership roles, as long as they're under the authority of a man, that's still, it's almost like they're still silent on these two verses, like the only address 1 Corinthians 11 through 3, yes, we'll say women need to be under authority, but it sounds very harsh here. A woman should be quiet, not even to teach. So I just would like to go into more detail about that.
Okay. Well, it's as we started to get into it a couple of sessions ago, I think that might have been 2 sessions ago, two Q&A sessions, that we began to talk about this, and I think we even mentioned at that time, go back and listen to it, those of you that haven't heard it, you can go onto our library at lbcdfw.org and go back to the previous discussion that Sarah referenced here. It would be a good prelude to what we're going to carry on with here. And it is a big discussion. It's a very important discussion, a very sensitive discussion, because especially here in our culture, our secular culture in the 21st century, where an important aspect of our culture is equality between men and women.
Yes.
And that wasn't the case 2,000 years ago in the ancient Greco-Roman world where Paul is writing his letters. It was not a culture, secular culture, where equality between men and women was a big issue. Now, arguably in the Roman culture, women had evolved to a significant autonomy. In the Roman world, women could own property. They could exercise a lot of authority in their realms that prior to centuries earlier, especially even in the Jewish culture, that just wasn't the case. So I don't want to say the Roman world that Paul wrote in was just significantly primitive in that regard. The Roman culture had evolved a lot in terms of women's rights, but under Roman law, compared to men, women had comparatively little legal rights and legal protection. That was just the world that they lived in. So as Paul is writing letters for the fledgling church, a fledgling church just means it's new. It's like a new chickling that has just been birthed and needs a lot of care. As Paul's writing to the fledgling churches that he's only in the past few years established, he's writing into a Gentile world, into a Gentile culture, where you really need to pull yourself out of the 21st century culture where women and men are essentially equal in virtually all respects. Some may argue with that, but essentially here today, there's essential equality between men and women under the law and in practice. That wasn't the case with Paul. He was writing letters into the Gentile world, Gentile culture, where men still ruled the roost. Paul couldn't just ignore that. And so you see some of that coming out as Paul used allegory a lot. And this is sort of like my first, not my first, but my first and my main Greek professor at seminary, who's a good friend of mine now. He's a world-renowned Greek scholar that I'm privileged to call friend. He wrote in his very well-known advanced Greek grammar that the Bible, and this is something that is really important to students of the Bible. He wrote, the Bible is patently, his word, patently means pervasively metaphorical. And if you read the Bible with literal eyes, that if it has a literal sense, you're just going to apply the literal sense, period, and stop there and not go beyond into the metaphorical sense, you're going to miss the meaning. So Paul often wrote in the context of double entendre. Paul was famous for having a double meaning to what he's writing. And so often, in the case of talking about men and women, he would have the secular context in mind. He's writing to a Gentile world where there's brand new Christian churches being established. They are firmly established in their ideas of the relationship between men and women, but legally, culturally, in the house, in business, in the community. That's who Paul's writing to. And it's going to be very important to know something about that culture when you're reading Paul, so that you don't misinterpret him. And then beyond the cultural aspect, then there's the spiritual aspect. Paul is writing into the Greco-Roman secular culture of brand new churches that are coming up with Gentiles, many of whom have no Jewish roots. They just come out of a pagan Gentile culture where men rule the roost, and women are very subordinate and subservient to men. He's writing about a brand new spiritual context that's not of this world. And so Paul, brilliant man, brilliant writer, brilliant in the Hebrew scriptures, anointed by God to bring this new covenant reality into the Gentile context. Paul speaks in analogies and typologies and sometimes allegory, but I want to say mostly analogy and typology. He does use allegory. Galatians chapter 4 is a good example. So those are where he will use things that are real, that people would know and understand, he would speak about them in order to help illustrate an unknown, very complex spiritual reality. And so obviously the relationship between men and women became one of those realms that Paul talked about in the context of Greco-Roman secular culture that his readers would understand perfectly well immediately. They would understand that they live in that context. And he would use that as analogy and typology to help them understand a new reality,
Okay.
a spiritual reality. That's the setting here,
Okay.
that if we're going to talk about men and women in Paul's writing, we've got to understand the setting here. So let me hand it back to you and say,
No, that helps.
thoughts?
That's good. I'm sitting here following because I always wonder, are we missing? We're reading it only in our setting, and so we have to go back and understand. That's why I love when you give the history of it. Okay, so I'm following you with the setting.
Okay, so now let's take one of the most blatant, obvious examples of gross, destructive, very damaging misinterpretation to the church, where the literal sense has been all that's been apprehended because the figurative typology that Paul was representing was totally lost, totally misunderstood. In 1 Corinthians, women shall be silent in the church. I remember the first time I read that, I'm looking at it and say, are you kidding me? That's like half the people in the church.
Right.
This is, in fact, if you want to be honest about it, I think you could make a good case, arguable case, that the women in the church, through the history of the church, have tended to be the strongest in their faith.
I would agree.
Stronger than, on average, they've been more passionate, stronger in their faith, more aggressive in talking about their faith and working out their faith in their lives. So I read that and said, are you kidding me? You're actually going to tell half of the spirit-regenerated believers that in a church setting, they have to be quiet? This is my first thought as I read that. Now, I'm just for the sake of brevity here, and then we're going to get on with the conversation, but you think of how you want to have this conversation. I'm just going to give what's the figurative sense here. When you understand Paul's spiritual teaching on the church, and which you can go to chapter 11, where he says that the man is the head of the woman, and Christ is the head of the man, and God is the head of Christ, that Paul obviously is talking, I say obviously, this may be new to some of the people that are listening, he's in a completely spiritual context. But he's using the analogy of the secular cultural context, where they know that in the secular cultural context of the Greco-Roman world, that men are the above the women in a very strong, very definite, both legal and just secular context. And so he's representing the spiritual reality in that context. And in Paul's spiritual context, the woman is representing the spirit-regenerated believer, and the glory of the woman is her hair, representing her covering. The glory of a woman is represented by the human sin-infected mind. Now, don't get upset by that well, they're degrading women. No, Paul, you have to tie into and connect with what Paul is representing here as the spiritual reality in the church. And so he's talking about a male believer here as being represented figuratively, spiritually, as a woman, as a man, as Christ, as God, a male believer, and a female believer in the same context. He's talking about a believer here that can be viewed through the lens of the woman, the man, Christ, and God. And it's not about men in terms of human biology, but rather men and women, and the idea, analogical idea of men and women in their individual context as spirit-regenerated believers. As a spirit-regenerated believer, Steve Goodall is a woman in the sense that I'm a new believer. I'm the bride of Christ. I'm spirit regenerated. Christ is the groom. I'm part of the bride. This is the woman. And in Paul's spiritual context in chapter 11, which carries right into chapter 14, where he says the woman is to be silent in the church, the woman in this spiritual context, which applies to me, Steve Goodall, the woman is the spirit regenerated believer with a sin-infected mind. This is the woman. You can take it right back to the garden where the first woman was deceived and was the first to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the woman, Steve Goodall, as represented in this spiritual reality, the woman is the the spirit regenerated believer, a child of God, a new creation who remains sin-infected from the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I like what I like. I have opinions and judgments, and this is the woman. And so what Paul is saying in the church, when you start talking in terms of fellowship among the spirit regenerated people of God, it is no longer but it is not acceptable to bring into play the sin-infectedness, the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's to be left out of the context of the church. What's applicable in the church, which is represented by the covering of the man, is edification from the Lord. It begins with faith to believe, and then beyond faith to believe, the Lord continues to edify those who will worship in spirit and truth. That's represented spiritually. The spiritual context that Paul is talking about in chapter 11, that you have to interpret women shall be silent in the church through, is the man is aner. It's not anthropos, it's aner. This is a position, a position of honor, aner. And aner is the representation of the spirit regenerated believer, having died to self, that comes into spiritual fellowship with the Lord and receives subsequent to that edification. That's what you bring into the church context, the church fellowship, is the edification, divine edification from the Lord. And that includes not least, but sound biblical doctrine, correct understanding of the Holy Scriptures, which the Lord, one of the primary purposes of divine edification is good, sound, biblical doctrine. That's what's acceptable in the church fellowship. That's the covering of the aner man in the spiritual context, whether it's Sarah, the female spirit regenerated believer, or Steve Goodall, the male regenerated believer. That's the entire context that applies to each of us individually. And so in that context where, I'll just kind of finish this, Paul wrote in chapter 11, this is really fascinating when you see this context. Paul said, if a man has a covering on his head, it's a disgrace. The man is not to come with his own covering. The whole concept there is the idea of the man is the aner man. That aner is a figure of honor, not anthropos, aner. That's just the vernacular sense that it was used in that context, particularly in a Jewish context that Paul grew up out of. Aner is often used for a man who's married. He's not anthropos, he's aner, often translated now as husband. So aner could be man or husband, but it always infers honor. And so the man who has a covering on his head is to his disgrace. Why? Because the man is the one that represents the dying to self, becoming naked, uncovered before the Lord. The mind removed from the process, or then Christ becomes the head of the man. So the whole spiritual context that Paul is teaching here in Romans chapter 11 is that the man, aner, is representative of divine edification from the Lord, particularly in proper, good, sound understanding of the Scriptures. And the woman, gune, the woman, is representative of the tree, the knowledge from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is not acceptable in the church fellowship. In church fellowship, the only thing that is worthy of being spoken is that which is given by the Lord. Whether it's a prophetic word, a word of knowledge, an interpretation, or just divinely given proper understanding of the Scriptures, which, by the way, there'd be a discussion for another time maybe. You have to ask, well, how can the church get the Scriptures so wrong and not understand this spiritual reality that Paul is speaking to, but he's doing it through the double entendre of a secular reality that they would be well familiar with to help describe this very difficult, very new, very complicated, until you understand it, spiritual reality. So you can carry that into chapter 14, where he writes that the women should be silent in the church. Then you know that that applies to both men and women, spirit-regenerated believers. Keep your knowledge of the tree of good and evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Keep your sin-infected opinions and judgments that come from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that are not given by the Lord. Keep them out of the church. They have no place in the church. The women shall be silent in the church. That's exactly what Paul was meaning. But not understanding the spiritual context that Paul was teaching in, the church has taken that verse and treated it like a hammer, and has abused and misused and has corrupted the meaning to great damage to the church, in particular to the women in the church. So this, I'm going to hand it off to you, Harold. Let's keep talking about this.
So I have three real big thoughts. One, my first thought is this is very overwhelming to me, because even though I've been listening for so long and I think I have a little bit of understanding, I hear everything you're saying and it makes me realize just how much I don't understand. So that's one thing, which is okay because I have plenty of time to keep learning.
You get one nugget at a time.
One nugget.
That's how God's worked with me.
Right.
We all just get one nugget at a time.
You have to chew on it. Okay, so then my second thought is this. If, as you've said, the church has hammered and mistreated women because of these verses. But at the same time, I haven't seen in my growing up women being mistreated of these verses. I have seen these verses completely ignored. So that's one thing that's always bothered me. And so I love listening and like, okay, well, they were never meant to be ignored. There's a well of truth. So I'm excited about that. That's my second thought.
They've been ignored because if they don't ignore them, they don't know how to improve them. They basically are going to silence women, and they don't want to do that. They kind of know intrinsically that that's not right. I just don't know what it means.
Right.
And so
either
just take it off the table.
Yeah, so let's just take it off the table and do whatever we want, which, okay. So then my third thought kind of goes along with this. I think what it all boils down to in my thinking is we're trying to read these scriptures and put them into our building, our church building, our pastor, associate pastor, deacons, elders thought. That is never what Paul was setting up and talking about. When he talks about the fellowship, in my mind, even though I've been trying to retrain my mind to think differently, in my mind, when you talk about church fellowship, I immediately go to a church building, the structure of a church, the way it's run, which is not what Paul was speaking into.
No, the culture Paul was speaking into is you had a relatively few believers that would go to somebody's house, and they would have a leader. They would have a senior leader in the church, but they would be basically an equal fellowship submitted to the Lord. And so in the house churches that Paul is writing about, there was relative equality. You know, for instance, the house church in Ephesus that was in the home of Priscilla and Aquila. First off, and this is important, in ancient epistles, ancient letters, you always named people in the order of their significance. When Paul referred to Priscilla and Aquila, and I think he did about a half a dozen times, you can go look at it. It's very important to see this. He always named Priscilla first. In fact, he had kind of an affectionate name. He called her Prisca. And it was always Prisca and Aquila. And there's no accident there. He is essentially, in the literary culture of the ancient Greco-Roman world, giving Prisca a higher status than Aquila. And it's no accident that Paul would do that. And so in the home church at Ephesus of Priscilla and Aquila, they were the leaders, essentially, of this new church at Ephesus. He actually put Priscilla up in he's kind of saying, hey, if I got to name one first, it's going to go to Priscilla. Chew on that one.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to think of how, I mean, that's one thing I encourage people that are listening to listen to Sunday mornings, because there's so much history and you see how this has been persecuted out. But it just I just keep thinking, how is this so lost? Like, I didn't even know until this morning that Paul sent Deborah, wait, who did he send it? Not Deborah. Is it Deborah?
Phoebe?
No, Phoebe.
Mm-hmm.
Was that with his letter?
Mm-hmm.
And if he is seriously meaning he wants women shut down, shut out, put in a basement, he would never mention these women. He would never send them.
Yeah.
So
let's tell our audience who Phoebe is.
She was sent with the book of Romans. She was sent with the letter to Rome.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I know that who she is.
So that's a powerful thought there. So Paul, in the ancient Greco-Roman world, where in the culture women did not have equal status with men, Paul had just written in early AD 57, the winter of AD 57, he had written arguably his most important letter, Romans, which I think was significantly more for the church leadership in Jerusalem than it was for the church at Rome, albeit it was for both. But he knew it was going to Jerusalem. But his most important letter, Systematic Theology of the Faith, who did he send as his ambassador with the letter to Romans to the church at Rome, which Paul was not familiar with, and they were not familiar with Paul? He sent his letter with a woman, Phoebe, who he called a deacon. There's the female version, deaconess, but still the same noun as the male deacon. It's just Greek terms have a female version and a male version, so it was the female version for her, but it's the same noun as deacon. And so don't in your mind say, well, it's a lesser form of the term than what is applied to male. No, it's the same word. It's just you got to use the female version when you're talking about a woman. So he called her a deaconess, a deacon, an official, if you will, servant in the church at Cenchrea. Cenchrea is kind of the neighbor city to Corinth. Corinth is on the Sea of Corinth, and then there's a little isthmus of land, and then you go to the gulf that goes into the Aegean Sea. And so there's this little strip of land. Corinth is on the west side. Cenchrea is on the east side. And so they're kind of sister cities right there. So Phoebe was a deaconess, a deacon in the church at Cenchrea. And Paul is leaving Corinth at that time. He's written a letter, and he needs to get this letter to Rome. It's a complicated letter, just like Peter said. You know, some of the things that Paul wrote about are very complicated. Well, Paul knew that. And so he wanted somebody to take his letter to Rome that was qualified to explain it to the church at Rome. And the church at Rome was a synagogue church, very Jewish culture. Keep that in mind, where even more than Greco-Roman culture, women were second-class citizens in the Jewish culture. And so Phoebe, a Gentile woman, is taking this new letter, Romans, as Paul's ambassador to the church at Rome. She's his designated person to carry the letter and explain the letter. In other words, to teach Romans to this church in Rome, significantly a Jewish-centered culture. And here's a woman carrying the letter to go teach Romans. All of this has to be weighed in the context of what did Paul mean. And like, for instance, in when he's writing to Timothy, and he says, I don't allow women to teach in the church. When you start to consider what did Paul mean by I don't allow women to teach in the church, you have to do it in the context that Priscilla was the senior teacher of the house church in Ephesus, and Phoebe was the deaconess from Centuria that carried his letter Romans to go to the synagogue-centered church in Rome that didn't know Paul, to be their teacher of Romans, to explain what this letter means. And so when you interpret what Paul meant in his letter to Timothy, I don't allow the women to teach the men, you have to do it through that holistic view of Paul's letters and his ministry.
So he's saying that he doesn't let sin-infected minds put the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the fellowship. That has to be removed, and only the mind of Christ, when we're praying in the Spirit, to be released within his fellowship.
And the edification that comes with
Right.
that particularly.
And that's what he means about his fellowship. When
You have to interpret that comment, that propositional statement in the letter to Timothy through Paul's lens, through the lens of Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians and in Romans, where Paul clearly has a spiritual context when he's talking about the man and the woman, and he clearly had great favor upon Phoebe at Centuria, Priscilla in the house church at Ephesus. He clearly had great favor upon women in these early Christian churches that he was establishing in the Roman Gentile, Greco-Roman Gentile context. When you consider, you want to interpret, what did Paul mean in his letter to Timothy? I don't let the woman teach the man. What did Paul mean there? Well, clearly, when you understand 1 Corinthians and Romans and what's happening in that context, then you can understand the context in his letter to Timothy, which is still in the same milieu of his churches and his letters. The letters to Timothy were only written a couple of years after 1 Corinthians and Romans. It's still in that same milieu. You have to do it through that context. And in that context, you clearly see that he's not saying that Sarah can't be a teacher in the church to men. He's clearly not saying that. It's a spiritual context. He's saying, Sarah, leave your sin-infectedness to the extent that you can out of the church. What we bring into the church and the church teaching is what the Lord gives us, the edification from the Lord, whether it's Sarah or Steve Goodall. That's Paul's context.
This is fascinating and, like I said, overwhelming, because I think the church has just chosen not to acknowledge this. And so it's overwhelming, because it's like, people need to hear this. They need to know it's fascinating to me that the women is representing sin-infected thoughts and teachings in the church. Makes so much sense.
It's kind of hard for a 21st century woman to hear that for the first time, though, because it sounds chauvinistic and it's offensive. Right?
I don't think
Hearing
so.
it for a lot of women will.
They might. To me,
I think my daughters would be offended by that.
But but it includes.
And yeah,
but when
Robin said a lot of men would be offended. I was offended by that.
Yeah, when you
Yeah.
when you described it as when you said women, Stephen Goodall, and you were describing putting yourself, that takes all the offense out of for me,
Yeah.
because I'm like, when you explain it that way,
Because
it's-
I'm the woman in his spiritual
and
context.
women, we know they refer to the bride of Christ, and that includes men and women. That's not I mean, I might be weird. If it's a female, it's not weird. I'm like, I'm the bride of Christ. But as a man, you're like, I'm the bride of Christ.
That was hard for me for a while. I got, really? I'm the bride? Come on.
But when you listen to how you're saying it, the whole gender neutral actually of it is incredible, and it's fascinating. And I hope that this brings clarity to others and get your mind thinking. And that's why I just keep encouraging, if it's overwhelming, I think the first thing to do for me is to listen to the teachings on Sunday morning that go back to the history, and it makes it less overwhelming, because it's not that we weren't ever supposed to know this. We were supposed to know the truth
Yes.
as it's being presented right now, but it's been lost.
Yes.
So when it seems overwhelming, go back to the history and be like, oh, this is how we were supposed to know this truth. It's not supposed to be some secret code that we don't get to know until we get to heaven. It was persecuted out of the church. It has been, our minds have been crowded with other things. And the truth of it is just, I mean, I can't get over it, just fascinating to me.
Teach it. Thank you.
Just fascinating.
What else?
No, that's good.
This is a big, huge subject, and there may be another opportunity. There may be other things.
There might be
sparked
more,
in your
yeah,
mind
because
that
this
you
is
wanna
just a
talk
little, because eventually I do want to talk about, but not now because I know we don't have time, but maybe next week, why he put such emphasis on what they wear.
about.
So if we could get into that.
Yeah. Well, that would be a good thing
Okay.
to talk about.
Maybe next week. Maybe I'll go
Yeah.
home and listen to this again, make notes, and then maybe bring up some more of because the layers that just keep coming off.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, I can accept what you're saying. And for the most part, the church has accepted 1 Corinthians 11 to be spiritual, covered, uncovered. They don't expect women to go in with something over their head. They look at the covering, but they're not putting it in the right spiritual context. So
The church in that context is still trying to find a way to differentiate between biological men and
Yes.
biological women. And
Right.
instead of saying, no, every believer has all of these aspects applying to
Right.
him or her.
But exactly, but they're still saying, okay, there's something more there, but they won't address the others. So I can take what you've said this morning. I can understand what you mean by the women. It represents the sin infected. So I want to go back and re-listen and re-look and bring back some more, because this is so much deeper than what's women's role in the church. It's like that is not even the question anymore. What is our role in the just that kind of makes that question now seem silly. Like.
It's such a beautiful context when you see it in the context that Paul is applying all these dimensions to every spirit regenerated believer, whether you're a man or a woman. Then you can begin to understand it in the fullness of the gospel. And it's such a beautiful thing. And Sarah, and I think you're starting not starting, but I think you're well along in seeing that when you understand the fullness of the gospel, it's really the most simple thing. There's really nothing complicated about it. God gives faith to believe, and he wants
One thing.
from his children. He wants to be worshipped
Yep.
a certain kind of way.
That's right.
Yeah, the worship that God provides from the heavenlies. Okay, well, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Again, I enjoy so much having these conversations because, as I said, and it's worth saying it here again, Sarah takes what we teach here at Legacy Bible Church about the fullness of the gospel, and you really have such a good way of putting the rubber on the road. You know, where's the beef? And your conversations are always centered on the practical aspects of the faith, and that's so important. And I appreciate that very much. So God bless you. Listen, go back and listen to the teaching this past Sunday. He is risen. It was our Easter teaching. It's a long teaching, but it'll give you a great picture into the history of the church. about the whole idea of the crucifixion and the resurrection into this whole context that we just talked about here this morning. He is risen. Go back and listen. We love you. We'll be back with another teaching on Sunday at 10:30, and God willing, we'll be back next Wednesday normally with Sarah for another Q&A.
That's
We'll
right.
see you then.
Right.